Five. Good morning, everyone. Here we are on the last day of the BrELT Young Learner and Teens week, and we have our very own Bruno Andrade. So, for me, it is a pleasure to introduce him and to be here with him on a Sunday morning, at least in Brazil. For I don't know what time it is, wherever you are. Bruno is a teacher since the year 2000. He's the founder of BrELT and holds an MA in Applied Linguistics from UFRJ, the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, where he also works as an undergraduate professor for the EOT and International Affairs course. He teaches English to young learners, lower and secondary levels, at two private schools in Rio. And he's the public relations coordinator for the IATEFL, the International Association of Teachers of English as a Foreign Language, Young Learners and Teens Special Interest Group. So, Bruno, over to you. Break a leg.
Thank you, Edu. Thank you for the lovely introduction. And thank you for being here with me on a Sunday morning, at least for us. I hope you've had a great week, and this is the last day of your weekend. I hope you're doing fine and teaching very excitedly because we know it's the end of the year and most of us are very tired. So thank you for watching this webinar and thank you for participating in the BrELT Young Learners and Teens Week because we have put a lot of work and love into the organizing this event. So let's get started. I want to start by saying my motivations for doing this webinar. I've been writing my own materials to use in my class since for a long time, actually. And I started when I was assigned a role in a language institute where I was supposed to write materials for digital materials for teachers to use. And those materials, they were mostly taken from the news. So we had to find something that was going on in the world and bring it to the students, work on vocabulary, work on something or either grammar or vocabulary. And it had to be something that it was very general because teachers from different levels and different branches would be using these materials. And then I continued writing my own materials, and then later on I had the opportunity of writing a full course, a full online course. And whenever I train teachers for writing materials, to discuss about writing materials, they all ask me, what's the key thing about writing materials, and what are the challenges and what are the possibilities? And this is what we are going to discuss today. I'm going to be sharing my screen with you so that you can see my slides. Edu, can you confirm you see my screen already?
Yes, Bruno, we can see it.
Wonderful, wonderful. So the topic of this presentation is, Bruno, can we do that activity once more, writing, adapting, and assessing activities for young learners, language learning. The abstract I wrote goes like this: young learners work hard. Just let's read this so that we can keep it fresh in our memories. Young learners work hard to make sense of what teachers ask them to do and come to task with their own understandings of the purposes and expectations of adults. According to Geert, the activities that happen in class create a kind of environment for learning and as such provide different kinds of opportunities for language learning and possible problems. In this webinar, we will look into a framework for assessing activities from a learning perspective that takes account of young learners' social and cognitive development. Come and watch this webinar if you're interested in learning how to analyze possible benefits and adapting activities for the young learner classroom and creating your own. First, I believe it's important that in order for us to understand better how tasks work in the process of learning, we have to see children as mentally active learners and learners that will try to find meaning and purpose for the activities that are presented to them. Although young learners work very hard to make sense of what we tell them to do, um, they already come to class with their own backgrounds and with their own understandings of the purposes of and expectations of teachers. Um, I have researched some studies, and Tizard and Hughes in 1994, they claim that children quickly work out what expected of them and how to fit into new patterns of interaction. So therefore, our students, they bring these skills into the process of learning, making this urge to find meaning and purpose to be I think that teachers need to see this look for meaning and purpose as something very helpful, as something as something helpful for our teaching practices, so we can exploit that more deeply. Um, but the problem is that unfortunately anyone can have problems making sense of what they're told to do, or of the activities they are asked to perform, especially in language learning classes. Taking the combined effect of trying to make sense of what is expected from you or from a certain activity, plus the new language, it can be all very problematic. Um, I believe that teachers should be aware of the fact that young learners, they may act up as if they understood what's expected from them, and they may produce outcomes like picking out and repeating keywords from the teacher's language that gives the illusion of understanding. Or they may insist on doing an activity just for the sake of completing it, uh, without really understanding what they are expected to do. Just a second. Sorry, my cats have been jumping around crazy. Um, so we were saying that this illusion of understanding can be quite problematic for language learning. So I think it's very, very important to work on a pedagogical perspective that goes beyond a shallow evaluation of classroom activities. And it should give teachers tools for really checking on students' ability to make sense and learning. So I would like to present to you a concept developed by Lini Cameron in her very famous book, Teaching English to Young Learners in 2001, published in 2001, which is activity demands. To illustrate this key point, because this is a key point in the task framework that she developed, she shows in her book a speaking activity for young learners that contains 2 rows and 3 columns, where the rows represent the days of the week and the columns show 3 periods of the day. Morning, afternoon, and evening. So young learners, they have to create sentences using this vocabulary and grammar, and the vocabulary and the grammar they have already learned. So the main focus is to come up with structures such as Paulina played volleyball on Monday evening, for example, or Paulina danced on Tuesday afternoon. So this grid, this chart actually, it must be read in a particular way. The times of the day follow from left to right across the columns, and the days of the week go from bottom to top. Um, as adults, we know this convention, but it may be the first time for some children. Therefore, it's important for teachers to understand better the demands of students. Lini also classifies the demands, the activity demands into two categories: cognitive demands and language demands. Cognitive demands are related to to concepts and to understanding of the world and other people. Language demands, on the other hand, are related to using the target language and to uses of students' native language that supports and helps learning the learning process. There can be other demands on students that go beyond these two, right? For example, when students are asked to do a pair work activity, this is an example of demand, interactional demand. When students are invited to understand or use the language to talk about the language, for example, use the present perfect to talk about a past event in your life. This is an example of meta-linguistic demand. Involvement demands require children to keep on task for as long as it takes to complete it. And every young learner and teenager's classroom can involve physical demands. You can work on different activities. You can group them in different ways. For example, if you group your students or younger students, primary students, I'd say they love playing, for example, Simon Says, which involves a lot of total physical response activities. Or you may ask your teenagers to get into groups or stations so that it will increase their participation while the teacher works as a facilitator, helping to solve doubts and providing support for learning. This is all about physical demands. So here's a list I've taken from Cameron's book. She describes cognitive demands, language demands, interactional demands, meta-linguistic, involvement, and physical in a more detailed way. You can, when this webinar is done, you can, or you can, if you're watching it later, you can press pause and read it through. Or when it's done, you can come back and watch it again. And now I'd like to move on to task support, right? This is a picture from a book by Stanford, I'm sorry, which is called Brick by Brick. And I want to analyze, or maybe go through with you to see how a certain activity can provide support for students. Right? Look at this picture. This is a primary book for Brazilian students to learn English. So the first thing that comes to my mind when I look at this picture is that pictures play a big role. They support, they provide support for meaning, contextualization. It contextualizes the language to be used during the activity, right? Certainly, words and expressions that were previously learned, for example, here they are learning about clothes, but they already know colors. So the girl says, my avatar has a white hoodie. So white is a word that they already know. and these words and expressions they already know provide language support. Further support is given when the teacher explains or models the activity, right? In this case, a teacher can draw an avatar on the board and talk about it, or can draw her own avatar on the board if he or she is skillful enough to draw themselves. I am not, for certain. But you can always say, "Oh, this is me," and then or draw the doodle. Also, activities that are designed to be worked in pairs or groups, they can provide support for completing the task. Right, a more knowledgeable peer can help students who are in difficulty in doing the activity. More competent students can help others, and this is all about Vygotsky zone of proximal development, or Stephen Krasher's comprehensible input, in which you have to give, provide, to offer the students the right amount of teaching so that they can develop and learn together. So having all that in mind, it's important that we understand that there's got to be a dynamic relationship between tasks and support. We can, as I said before, we can recall the ideas of Stephen Krashen on comprehensible input, which is language input that can be understood by listeners despite them not understanding all the words and structures in it. It's more or less one level above that of learners, if it can only just be understood. According to his language acquisition theory, giving learners this kind of input helps them acquire language naturally rather than learning it consciously. So now I'd like us to turn our attention to what our teachers say about creating our teachers. By our teachers, I mean the BrELTers who answered my questionnaire. So thank you very much. If you've done that, you've helped me a lot. So what they say about creating their own materials, and the reasons why they do that, and the reasons why they don't do that. And by materials, I agree with Tomlinson in 1998, page 98, in which he states that materials are anything which can be used specifically with the intention of increasing students' learning and experience of the language. So it can be anything. It doesn't have to be something written. It doesn't have to be something that you previously planned. An activity or a material is anything that you use in a classroom that students will learn and experience language. So if you take a look at what teachers answered in my first question, if you create your own materials, please state the reasons for doing so. So it helps me personalize. Sometimes I create something to scaffold an activity. Because of diversity, I do it because course books only share heterosexual, white, and mid-upper class lifestyles, which does not depict the context I teach in it at all. There's cost involved. I create my own materials because there's no available material where I work. The lack of material. And in general, what teachers answered is that there is the problem with time, right? So teachers write materials when they have time to research, create, and test activities. That's the minimum, right? If you don't have time to research, if you don't have time to create, to sit down and write and think about, or to test activities in your context, because you have to work in a very fixed and tight schedule. You won't write your own materials. You won't have the need of writing materials. Also, it's important that uh, teachers have the freedom to adapt the school's curriculum. If they have freedom to adapt the school's curriculum, then they will feel engaged to write their own materials. Of course, there's got to be a justification, also a reason for doing so. So why would someone do something that requires a lot of time and a lot of effort if it's not worth it? And also experience, right? It's important that teachers gain experience so that they can write more materials, so that they can become more knowledgeable about writing materials. The browsers who answered my questionnaire support, in principle, the idea of creating their own materials, because it basically allows them to meet their students' needs in a more efficient way. So the things that come to us, the materials that we use, they are usually global materials. They are written for different contexts, and our classrooms are not the world's classroom, right? Each classroom has its own characteristics, their own way of working. Sometimes you have to work in a multi-level classroom, or sometimes you work in a very large classroom and you have to adapt the activities you work with. So the most common challenges that I believe you have already read some of the comments here, but the most common challenge that teachers commented on developing materials are time constraints again, focused continued professional development. It's very difficult to find courses and trainings that are focused on writing materials. Because of inexperience, some teachers may feel afraid of doing their own activities because they lack experience, and of course money, right? Sometimes writing activities requires money. You have to buy paper and materials and stationery, something, and envelope. It requires money. So why spending our very hard gained money to create more materials, right? And also this is what I talked about: time, freedom, reason, experience. Time is always an issue for us teachers. It is therefore important that we bear in mind the reasons why teachers choose to develop their own materials may vary, and we need to consider possible outcomes for activity when developing it. If you have problems with time, my suggestion is that you ask for help. You ask your students to help you out, cutting, pasting, copying, doing stencils. They are all examples of activities that young learners can do to lessen your workload. Another problem that teachers may face is the lack of expertise in developing materials. But what most teachers neglect is their almost innate ability to adapt activities to our context. Sometimes we have to adapt activities due to time constraints, number of students in class, or because something you might want to include or to take it out of the lesson because it will engage your students better. One way that teachers can start creating their own materials is to adapt in small ways activities from course books or lesson plans that are available online. You may try adapting them so that they fit your classroom setting or your linguistic goal, for instance. But how can we make sure adapting activities is a good idea? David Petrie created in 2015 a diagram that tries to encapsulate the process of evaluation and adaptation of activities that teachers might benefit from. So here's the diagram. And as you can see, I'm going to send you the, oh no, I don't have it here. So here's the diagram, and as you can see, it ends in one of 5 possible solutions. One of the solutions is the course book as it is, to use the course book as it is. If you believe that the material you have matches your needs with your learners, then not changing the course book is the best solution. Possibility number 2 is an alternative option. If it's the case where using the course book is not mandatory at all at your school, you may mix your course book activities from other course books or supplementary books for suitable materials. Or maybe even try to create your own versions of activities. Another possibility is the soft editing. At this stage, you can choose to create a different start or a different end to a certain activity. You can also mix the parts of activity or substitute them with something different. A heavy editing, and if you have to use the school's material and you have a fixed syllabus to cover, you can search or create your alternative lessons or activities. This material will have to be around the key focus of your material so that you can supplement the lessons, but at the same time you don't divert too much from the curriculum. An example of it will be using the same grammar activity from the course book as part of a bigger activity, a group of activities, or maybe even other lessons. Skipping and moving on, which is the last possible solution. If it does not compensate to use the material you have, then the best thing to do is to question why you're using that material. If the materials is in the syllabus and you must deal with it, or more importantly, if you think your learners need to work on this area, either option 2, which is an alternative option, or option 4, heavy editing, should be your choices. Should be your choices. But if there is no need to do it, why bother? So these are the 5 possible endings. In conclusion, the diagram roughly represents the thought process of a teacher who wishes to know if adapting the materials they have is a good option. Some of you may already do it instinctively, but however, it is often the case that when we get frustrated because we may have to deal with a tricky material, activity, or lesson, the evaluation process gets even more complicated, you know? That's when the diagram, that's when diagrams like this can be helpful, because they will allow you to take a step back and reach a quick decision about what to do with the material. So, a tip. Since they are more manageable in size, it's a good idea to start designing and adapting individual learning activities. Adapting or designing an activity may not take too much time, but the biggest gain is that teachers who do that gradually develop their confidence. This could lead on to the designing of several linked activities for a lesson, and later to the creation of a series of lessons to form larger units of material, right? Now let's move on to how can we evaluate activities. An effective language learning activity must have a clear objective, have a meaningful purpose for learners, have clear results for learners, involve learners, and facilitate language learning. David Moonen, in his book Designing Tasks for the Communicative Classroom, talks about 7 components of an effective activity, which are the goal, which is the teacher's aim in using certain activity. It is what we want to achieve through the activity, or simply put, the young learner's purpose in doing the activity. The input, which is the material the young learners will work on, for example, a video, oral instructions, a text. The procedures, what young learners will do with the input. For example, they will watch a video to find out information, or they will listen to an audio recording to find specific information. The outcome, it's about what young learners produce as a result of the activity. For example, drawing, a collage, a presentation, a storybook, etc. It's important to distinguish between product outcomes, which refer to the tangible result of an activity, for example, an answer to a question, a completed questionnaire, a drawing, from process outcomes, which refer to the skills, abilities, and attitudes that are acquired after completing a certain activity. For example, teamwork, confidence, collaboration. So again, outcome can be divided into two groups. Product outcomes, which are the tangible result of an activity, for example, completing a task, answering a question, doing making a drawing, completing a questionnaire, and also process outcomes. Process outcomes are the skills, abilities, and attitudes that are acquired after completing a certain activity. Teamwork, confidence, collaboration, creativity, these are all process outcomes. And letter E, the roles of the teacher, the many roles that we have to perform, which are drawn upon the activity. For example, a drill would require the teacher to model and control the activity, while a game would require us to step back and monitor the activity, right? So these are different roles that we play in class. The roles of the learners, it works the same way. So the roles of the learner are required to perform. For example, at times students have to be listeners so that they can answer as they were instructor, and other times they have to work collaboratively to solve problems, for example. Organizations, the last one, is the various patterns of interaction that can be arranged, pair work, individually, trios, work class. Whole class, I'm sorry. So again, the goal, the input, the procedures, the outcome, the roles of the teacher, the roles of the learners, and the organization. These are all the 7 components of an effective activity. Okay, so bear this in mind. 7 components of an effective activity: goal, input, procedures, outcome, roles of the learner, roles of the teacher, or organization. Now I'm going to show you another activity by Brick by Brick, published by Stanford. And let's take a look at the goal, the input, the procedures, the outcome, the roles of the teachers and the learners, and the organization. If you take a look at this page, it's very simple, it's very beautiful, it's to the point. It's not, there's not too much written text or anything that might hinder learning. So the goal here is to learn about the weather, okay? The input, what's the input here? Pictures and text. Procedures. For example, ask students what they see, if it is cold or hot, if they prefer cold weather or hot weather, okay? The outcomes. Students will learn the pronunciation of the lexical items in the page by listening and repeating them. Or students will complete the gap fill activity in number 3. These are all outcomes that might happen during this activity. The roles of the teacher. The teacher directs and controls in the beginning of the lesson, but slowly shifts control to a more monitoring role, as you would be able to see it in the teacher's guide. The roles of the learners. The students act as partners and listeners, so they have to perform these 2 roles. And organization is initially students are organized as a whole group, and patterns of interaction vary throughout the lesson. So I hope that you felt good after analyzing a lesson in this manner, because um, I believe that among many benefits, analyzing lessons in this perspective means allowing us to decide if the activity is suitable or not for our context. It also shows us, allows us to understand how teacher-led an activity is, or how much participation will be required from the students. And all that combined will allow us to identify aspects of the lesson that need to be adapted, supplemented, or modified. For example, if we wanted to make activity 3, okay, look at the activity 3. Find information on the map, complete the sentences. A, in England, it's ta-na-na and ta-na-na. In China, it's ta-na-na and ta-na-na. If we wanted to make this activity more interactive, for example, learners could also take on the role of decision makers, which would turn the activity into a more collaborative one. Maybe you could have students exchange information to fill in the gaps, or to creatively come up with alternative options, making it more meaningful and more communicative, right? They are told to work with China, England, China, France, and Japan, but they can talk about other countries they already know, or maybe even point out in the map. Now let's talk about how to select activities for young learners, for teaching English to young learners. And by young learners, I mean the whole spectrum of young learners and teenagers. I think that many times we don't have to make the criteria we use to select the activity very explicit, but when we ask ourselves questions like these, it will empower us to use a certain activity, to reject it, or to edit. So the questions that I thought that would be interesting for you to ask yourself is, how much time will preparation take up? Can I use it with my groups in terms of possibilities, right? In terms of pedagogical aims, or in terms of philosophical or mindset of your school. Which skills will it develop? Will my students like it? This is very important, right? Does it create a nice and judgment-free environment? Will it be too difficult for my students? So the level has to be taken into account. How long does it take? Will they use English or their native language? How students will be organized? Is it too noisy? Can it lead to arguments or fights? Do I have enough space to perform the activity? Is it too fast, too slow? Will students be engaged throughout the activity? Questions for you to think about. And now I've created I've actually adapted this checklist. And in case you find yourself in a situation where you are obliged to create your own activity, or if you're encouraged to do so, you may find this checklist interesting, or at least effective for you. So I have separated it, or divided it into 4 parts: learning goals, the students, the management, and learning principles. Learning goals refer to is the activity relevant to learning English? Are all receptive and productive skills included? About the students, sorry. Sorry. Is the difficulty level appropriate for my students? Is the level of language enough for my students to understand instructions and complete the task? Will my students enjoy doing the activity? Will they behave accordingly? Management. Do patterns of interaction vary? Will it make too much noise? Do I have all the material needed? Do I have enough time? Am I willing to devote my time to prepare it? Do I have enough space? Does the activity present a need for using English? A real need. Learning principles. Does it create a positive environment? Does it provide opportunities for students to experiment and notice language patterns? Does it use students' imagination? Does it reject stereotypes? Does it promote diversity? Does it follow your country's copyright laws, downloading of images, reusing text, and etc.? These are all things that we have to bear in mind when choosing when editing or doing an activity. So when we should use this checklist? So this checklist would be useful when you're choosing an activity from a textbook, when you're deciding whether to suggest a certain book for your school, when you're deciding whether to adapt lessons created by other teachers, or when you're designing your own activities. And as I said before, if you have no experience whatsoever in creating materials, a great start is to adapt those you find in textbooks or online. This will certainly develop your confidence. Regardless whether you want to create your own materials or adapt them, the process of adapting an activity to meet certain needs, the process of trying them out with your groups and reflecting on how effective they came out is an essential way of gaining new perspectives on your teachings. So, looking back at what we have seen, we talked about reasons for designing your own materials, and the main argument is to make sure that you find a better fit between your teaching and the needs of your students. And problems to overcome are lack of time, lack of expertise, lack of resources or references, okay? And sometimes lack of money. We talked about how to analyze an activity using different components such as outcomes, goals, organization, teachers and students' roles. And when we analyze activities according to according to their components, we are better able to decide on their usefulness and a way of adapting them to fit our objectives better. We also talked about the kinds of criteria which we use to select, write, and assess activities for young learners. No single activity will ever be capable of meeting all our needs in our criteria, in our criteria, in our context. So we must prioritize which will depend on our goals and the needs of our young learners on any particular occasion. We also talked about the value of writing and editing our own activities, trying them out, and evaluating their effectiveness as a way of reflecting on our teaching practices. This will certainly enable us to stand back from the routine and of our daily teaching and consider it from a different perspective. Oh, so we can just end this presentation with a reflection about published materials which are designed for a global audience, not for students, not for our students specifically, right? We have a very important role to cover. Just a second. To cover, which is to carefully select and adapt to published materials or write activities specifically for our students. But if you want to invest your ability to do so, we must step back from our materials and analyze them in different ways, to consider how they work, how students will respond to them, and our reasons for doing so. And let me just stop sharing my screen. Oh, this is my email if you need to reach out to me. And I would like to end this presentation saying that when we reflect on the selection and the creation and the adaptation of activities, we are more able to assess whether and why certain activities will help us achieve our goals. So we can adapt or improve activities, and this awareness that will be developed will allow us to have greater control over our own practices. We will certainly be able to make better decisions about using activities based not just on a vague feeling, but on clearly articulated criteria, which are supported by our experience in teaching English. Okay, so I hope you have enjoyed this presentation, um, and I want you to stay tuned for more news about the topic that will be shared on BrELT very, very soon. Uh,
Uh,
are you there, Eduardo?
Adam.
Yes, yes, Bruno. Thank you. It was fantastic.
Oh, thank
Oh,
you.
thank
We've
you.
had so many insights
I
here.
was worried
I
about
was
time
worried
when I
about
saw it was
time when I
like
saw it was like
9:40 already. So,
9:40
oh my
already.
god,
So,
I
oh my
have to
god, I
rush.
have to rush.
And the reflections you caused with your presentation, it was like priceless. So
Yo,
it's
thank
okay for
you.
people
Thank
to
you.
wait for
Thank
a
you.
couple more minutes. It's all right.
Yes.
Yes.
Bruno,
Wonderful.
we've got some questions here.
Okay.
The
Okay.
first question is how does the awareness of different demands guide or shape the design of the activity? And do you try to establish different demands in different tasks for one lesson?
Yeah, I think that
Yeah, I
the
think that
demand
the demand
will depend
will
on your context, right? If you and your goals, I mean, I think that the goals will be more important than your context. If you want, for example, to have your students to improve their speaking abilities, so you have to balance task support and demands in a different way. So I think it will all depend on your goals first of all, and then on your context.
Thanks, Bruno. Thanks. Also, we have another question here. Do you think authentic materials are more challenging for young learners, and why?
If I think
if
that
I think that
are more challenging for young learners, I don't know if I don't know if I get the question. Can you ask the person to clarify a bit?
Yeah, I'm just gonna wait for the person to expand on that. Meanwhile, we have another question. How about the role of L1 in second language acquisition? Do you consider that part of the discussion taking place while the activity is done will be in students L1, and where do you stand?
Can you repeat that?
can you repeat
You
that? You
Sorry, is it better now? Can you hear me?
yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So we've got some clarification from the authentic material question.
Whatever you
Do
want.
you think
Whatever you
so? The questions were: do you think authentic materials are more challenging for young learners? And the person said that it's in relation to book made materials, like course book materials, when they involve uh,
Authentic language.
authentic
authentic
language.
materials. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we have
we have
to
to
establish that
establish that
what we call authentic is real language being used in real context, right? Um, I think it's all very beneficial for young learners to be exposed to authentic materials, and by that I mean not only by the binary linguistic system, American and British ways of speaking English, right? I think that students have to be exposed to authentic materials that come from any kind of region or country or whatever English is spoken, because after all, English doesn't belong to anyone, it belongs to the world.
True. True. And the last question was the following: uh,
Mm.
how about the role of L1 in second language acquisition? Do you consider that part of the discussion taking place while the activity is done will be in students L1? So, how do you see that this dynamic happening in the classroom?
Well, I think that L1 is a tool for learning English or learning any kind of language, and we should never neglect it as because I've worked at places where Portuguese was forbidden. You couldn't speak you couldn't speak Portuguese with your students. Um, I think that students benefit a lot from using Portuguese in I say Portuguese because it's my context, but L1, let's say, in language learning because especially because sometimes when you want to express your opinions, you want to do it like in a more honest way. Well, while using a target language, but also in term when you're working with young learners, it may help to clarify meaning. It may help. It may also help when you are dealing with classroom management, for example. Of course, if a student is misbehaving in class, you're not going to call their attention in English. You are going to call their attention in their native language because this is the language that they will relate in a deeper level. I think.
I see. Thank you, Bruno. Thank you very much. And
Mm-hmm.
before we, so thanks for everybody watching us on YouTube. Thank you for the questions. We've got some more questions, but unfortunately, we don't have enough time to
We don't
answer them. So I told people to ask questions on BrELT on the Facebook group, so they can
uh-huh.
actually interact with you
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
and ask you more questions. Before we
Yes,
finish this webinar, I've got something important to say. It is about the certificates. I've just shared my screen. I don't know if you can you see that, Bruno?
let me see. Let me see. Yes, yes.
Okay, so the certificates for this session will be offered for those who attended the session live only. Yeah, so in case you're watching this session in a recorded mode, unfortunately, we cannot award certificates for you. So if you're watching the session live right now, just go to this link on the screen and fill in the form, and we'll be sending your certificates later today and or the beginning of next week. Okay. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Bruno, for making this
Thank you
webinar
all.
possible.
Very nice.
We hope to see you soon. Bye bye, guys. See
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Bye. Bye.